2,500 years ago, a man was born whose ideas would shape the lives of billions and the thinking of a nation. The country is China. And his name is Kongzi, known in the West as Confucius. Born into an age of violence and war, Confucius was the creator of a political and moral philosophy that was designed to bring harmony to the chaos of his times. His extraordinary story saw his ideas rejected in his own lifetime, but adopted by China's emperors after his death. They have survived China's rich and tumultuous history to influence countless lives, not just in Asia, but across the world. His teachings have been the foundation of Chinese education for nearly 2,000 years. His ideas of meritocracy, obedience, and moral leadership have profoundly shaped China's political and economic landscape. And his belief in the power of ritual and etiquette to unite a nation still governs everything, from ceremonies of state to the most important unit of Chinese life, the family.
To understand China, one must understand Confucius and his legacy.
The story of Confucius's life was first written down in the Han Dynasty, 400 years after his death. After centuries of civil war, this was an era of peace and prosperity, of great innovation and scholarship, in which many of the customs and traditions that define China to this day were born. At the heart of court, the grand historian Sima Qian devoted his life to writing the first full history of China, the Shiji. Contained within it is a narrative of the events, rulers, and families who had made the most important contribution to the Chinese Empire, including the first full biography of Confucius.
天下君王，至于贤人众矣，当时则荣，莫则言。孔子不疑，传师于世。学者宗之。
A mixture of fact, oral history, and Sima Qian's imagination, this biography is still one of the main sources for the story of Confucius's life. And it documents the struggles he endured to get his ideas heard.
颜回入见，孔子曰：“回诗云：‘非死非虎，率彼旷野，吾道非邪？吾何为于此？’ The biography of Confucius by Sima Qian is actually so important because it's the first attempt, the very first one, to draw together many stories that emerged in the 300 years since Confucius' death. I think Sima Qian was so alert about the very human side of Confucius, how such a man was able to not only survive, but to pass on something very important about being human, about being a moral person. And of course, Confucius had no idea that whatever he said would eventually end up being so important to the Chinese.
孔子生鲁，长平乡周邑，生而手上于鼎，故因名曰丘云。字仲尼，姓孔氏。
Confucius's father, a retired military officer, had already fathered 9 daughters with his first wife, and a club-footed son with his concubine. But desperate for a healthy male heir, he courts the 17-year-old daughter of a local family.
所以他的父亲大约是60多岁的时候，又向严家求婚。严家呢，就是他的父亲就跟他的3个女儿商量：你们虽然嫁给他，哪儿都不吭声啊，谁愿嫁给一个老头啊？但是小女儿说呢，父亲说谁嫁给他就谁嫁给他。所以呢，他的这个第三个女儿呢，叫做严征在，就嫁给了孔子的父亲。
Desperate to conceive, Confucius's parents went to a local sacred mountain, Mount Ni, in order to pray for a son.
Sima Qian said the father and the mother of Confucius had a tryst in the wild. In Chinese, is 野交, and Confucian scholars were very uncomfortable with that idea. But I think what this means is this: that Confucius' father was about 60 when he had this relationship with Confucius' mother, who was in her teens, and that's perhaps considered very inappropriate. But it's also about, hey, Confucius was just very human from the beginning, and he had lots of problems to sort out as he grew up.
Sima Qian's biography became the subject of one of China's oldest picture book stories, called The Traces of the Sage. One edition has been carefully preserved in the Confucius archives in his home state of Shandong. Dating from the 15th century, it also included many other legends that gathered around Confucius after his death. In particular, the most famous version of his birth story.
这非常生动啊，非常这个情景，你一看这个，你就自己就能进到这个情景当中去了，是吧？非常。
This scene illustrates the visit to Confucius's mother of a mythical creature called a qiling. Made from different animals, the head of a dragon, the scales of a snake, and the body of a deer, in Chinese mythology, the qiling heralded the arrival of a great event. But it also tells us something significant about Confucius's humanity.
In Chinese tradition, people would think of deer, mainly the body of deer, with other parts of reflect the animal's mild disposition, mild nature. And deer never harm other animals, even never step on other insects. I think this is why qiling was so significant in this picture, to tell people the idea why Confucius is a very distinguished figure, not very much, one of the ordinary people.
Brought up in severe poverty after his father dies when he is just 3, The Traces of the Sage then tells the story of Confucius's early life. As a member of the Shi class, the young Confucius takes on a series of jobs, including managing the state's herds of oxen and sheep.
Shi, there are many ways of translating that character 是 I prefer this idea of the common gentleman. A common gentleman is just one level above the commoner. And what makes him sort of distinct from a commoner is that a common gentleman is allowed to have an education.
As a result, Confucius decides to open a school from which his reputation as a philosopher would be born, and which eventually, we are told, attracts over 3,000 students.
It's not schooling in our sense. It's not academic training. As with the early ancient Greek philosophers, it's schooling in a way of life by powerful people. So people with access to power, people with some leisure, people who wish to rule wisely and well.
古人喻明，明德于天下者，先治其国；欲治其国者，先齐其家；欲齐其家者，先修其身；欲修其身者，先正其心。
Over time, Confucius's teachings would form the basis of one of China's most sacred texts, the Analects. A collection of his most important thoughts and sayings, they have followed the development of Chinese civilization. Originally compiled by his disciples on fragile bamboo slips, the oldest fragments of the text have been discovered in tombs dating from 300 BC. And they reveal the circulation of different versions of the book in the centuries after his death. In the 2nd century AD, one definitive version was then fixed by being carved onto stone. Erected in the Imperial Academy for scholars to study and learn, this version became one of the foundational texts of the Chinese Empire. And this same text has been taught in schoolrooms across China for over 2,000 years.
时习之，不亦说乎？有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？人不知而不愠，不亦君子乎？有子曰：“其为人也孝悌。”
子曰：“三人行，必有我师焉。择其善者而从之，其不善者而改之。”
有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？人不知而不愠，不亦君子乎？
那《论语》呢，作为儒家最重要的一部经典，当中记述的都是孔子和他弟子言行的汇集。在当初，孔夫子是怎么样教育他的子弟的，乃至于他的弟子门人一些对话的记录。
The Analect is now the main source of Confucius's philosophy, and contained within it is the moral code that has become the touchstone of Chinese traditional culture.
学而时习之，不亦说乎？乐同，学之为言孝也。人性皆善，而绝有先后。那《论语》呢，作为中国人的圣经，可以说是每一位中国人都应该读诵的一部经典。那这里边所讲的呢，可以说都是关于古人讲的修身齐家、治国、平天下的这些道理。所以学的这些呢，这个就像古人讲的半部《论语》可以治天下。
Born around 551 BC, Confucius lived in an age of political chaos and war. At this time, China was divided into numerous states, each locked in a desperate and bloody battle for the domination of the country.
Confucius is born in an era when all he sees around him is continual warfare. One state fighting against another state, they're assassinating rulers and extinguishing kingdoms as fast as they can.
All in all, there are about 14 states fighting for their existence. A central core of around 8 smaller states, surrounded by a group of larger and more powerful neighbors.
Confucius's state is one of the small states. It's the state of Lu, and it borders the great state of Qi, and there's no question that the rulers of Qi were intent on swallowing up Lu.
Desperate to find a solution to the violence of his age, Confucius looked back to the past. In particular, to the era of the early Zhou kings, who had ruled large parts of China 600 years before.
Many people, including Confucius, looked back to the Zhou as a golden age, as a time when rulers governed their people with virtue and kindness and compassion.
Unlike the political disorder of his own times, Confucius believed this was a period of peace and stability, thanks in large part to the ancient rites, customs, and etiquette that bound Zhou society together, a concept he called Li.
Li, reduced to basics, is ceremony, ritual. It also refers to what we think of more generally as customs, social practices. What I say when I greet an old friend, what I say when I express reverence for a teacher or a parent. Confucius pointed out how very important those customs and practices are as the glue of society, of keeping us together.
道之以政，齐之以刑，民免而无耻；道之以德，齐之以礼，有耻且格。
In order to learn about the ancient rites and customs firsthand, in 518 BC, when he was around 33, Confucius left the state of Lu. Given a carriage and 2 horses, he traveled a great distance to the ancient capital of the Zhou kings in modern-day Luoyang.
为什么要到洛阳去呢？因为洛阳是当时的周朝的首都，因为国家的礼仪的那些规定啊，还有那些文献啊，主要都在那儿保存着。孔子在洛阳的时候呢，他还非常有幸见到了老子，因为老子是当时候的州下使，就相当于现在的国家档案馆和国家图书馆的馆长。孔子呢，也就能够呢更好的、更熟悉了周代的这些 文献还有它的这个礼仪的规定。
The rituals that Confucius went to study were above all the sacred rites, in particular the ancestral rites that were essential in keeping the human world in harmony with the cosmos.
When we talk about many of the rites, what we're talking about is blood sacrifices, offerings of blood and wine, and offered to the ancestors and the gods in heaven. The ancestors live in heaven and become themselves gods in the afterlife. But one doesn't just set out meat and wine. In each case, when offering them, one has to bring to it a particular attitude of reverence. The reimagining of the ancestors, in a sense, brings them back to life with each and every offering.
There's really a kind of religiosity in it. You're still grounded in the human world, but there's an elevation. One has to very clearly distinguish that kind of religious experience from, I would say, religious experience that involves a creator with a force that's outside of the human world.
The vessels used in these ancient sacrifices of the Zhou kings are now held in the National Museum in Beijing. From enormous sacrificial bowls and stunning sets of bronze bells to intricately cast drinking vessels, these artifacts are testament to the sophistication of Bronze Age Chinese culture. But for Confucius, they also held a clear message. For the same skills that were used to create weapons of war in his own age could once again be used to create objects of harmony and peace.
What happened in this period was the beginning of the aestheticization of the human culture, lifting the human being out of our animality and making us into something that is elegant and enchanted. Confucius, at the beginning of a very troubled period, tried to reestablish this belief that had faltered as China became increasingly involved in war.
If the ancestral rites aimed for cosmic harmony, Confucius believed social harmony could be achieved by the reinforcement of the hundreds of smaller rituals that still govern Chinese life. From handshakes and greetings, to the relationship between young and old, teacher and student, or husband and wife.
The aim of Li is to generate a sense of community and caring within the participants of that ritual. So you have rituals like group eating. You know, if you're sitting among the family, the elder person usually eats first. But when you have drinking rituals, including the family and the teacher, the student is supposed to drink like this without facing the teacher. They're hierarchical rituals. So again, the ultimate purpose is to develop a sense of caring among the participants that would not otherwise be the case.
Confucius' genius lies in that realization that what he was doing was transmitting something that was already in everyday practice within the family, within the community. And so these rites, these ritual practices, which were not arbitrary, but have been tested through time by others.
Today, the ancient town where Confucius grew up is called Qufu. Now one of China's most historic cities, it is home to what we call the Sankong, the three Confucian sites. The first is the Kongmiao, the Temple of Confucius, which is the largest cultural complex in China after the Forbidden City in Beijing. Next door is the Kongfu, the Confucian mansion, where his later descendants were honored and lived in splendor. And on the edge of town is the enormous Kongling, the Confucian forest, where Confucius himself is buried, surrounded by generations of his family. In Sima Qian's biography, Qufu was also the setting for Confucius's greatest political success. At the age of 50, Confucius had entered local government and had been promoted to the role of sikao, the minister of crime, where implementing his ideas of li, he transformed the fortunes of his state.
孔子做了这个行政长官以后呢，他就制定了一整套的礼仪规范。他就根据人的身体的强弱来分配工作，根据人的年龄大小来分配食物。而且在市场上呢，这个卖牛羊的他再也不敢一早把牛羊灌得饱饱的去卖，坑人了，因为要按重量称嘛，把早晨起来多喝点水就能多卖钱，他坑人。到了孔子以后呢，就没有这些了，所以鲁国呢治理得非常好。
I think Sima Qian really wants to emphasize that Confucius did not educate by way of penal laws, but he preferred to educate by way of ritual practice. It's through ritual practice that people were able to have a sense of self-reform, that they realize their own wrongdoings and really want to correct these wrongdoings.
Over the past few decades, Confucian concepts of li in the Analects have seen a huge revival across China.
告诸往而知来者，子曰：不患人之不己知，患不知人也。
As part of this revival, at Beidongye village, just an hour's drive from Chufu, the morality of the Analects has been woven into daily village life.
养不教，父母过。他的意思呢，就是这个你当父母的生养孩子，你不教育就是父母的过错。这个言必信，行必果，就说话呢要守信用，行动呢要有结果。
For the past 2 years, the village elder has introduced Confucian lectures to the village, which begin with a daily broadcast of the Di Zi Gui, a simplified version of the Analects.
俺村的呢，我每天早晨呢，都从7点半的时候给村民就放《弟子规》，每天早晨放一次。这个咱通过放《弟子规》来提高村民的思想觉悟，来建设咱的和谐村庄。
其他小朋友，下面我找几个小朋友来齐读《弟子规》。弟子规，
弟子规，圣人训，首孝悌，次谨信，泛爱众。
我这个这年把的学习呢，咱村里确实发生了不少变化。那个原来不太孝顺老的变得孝顺了。这个族里之间不团结的。 变得团结了，邻里之间也更加和谐了。这个俺村西头有一个媳妇比较恶，曾经打过她婆婆。这个学习《弟子规》，她到书院里参加学习了3次，她确确实实发生了不少变化。她也感觉到自己觉得不对了。为什么感觉不对？就是大佬的本性就是社会上是具不光彩的事了。这个通过学习，我发现像俺村这个例子还很多很多的，这是其中的一个。 我这个村领导也好干了。
In Confucius's own lifetime, the reintegration of the ancient rites transformed the prosperity of his state. But the politics of his age soon conspired against him. The traces of the sage paintings tell the story that, threatened at the rise of Confucius's state under his guidance, the state of Qi hatched a plan that would have profound consequences on his life.
你有马，这个马的数量跟这个女士的数量都不是记载的那个数量。
According to legend, the state of Qi sent 120 of their finest horses and 80 of their most beautiful dancers to Lu Dingong, the Duke of Lu. And the Duke was so entranced, he neglected the court rituals and sacred rites, and the Li of the state collapsed in just 3 days.
This picture is very significant, very key, the turning point of his life. He tried a few times to persuade the Lu Dingong, please come back to taking care of the state affairs. Because he failed in persuading Lu Dingong, there's no hope for him to stay on. So he got to find some other way, go somewhere to realize his will.
Despondent, Confucius decided to leave, and joined by a group of his most loyal disciples, he traveled across China's war-torn states in an attempt to persuade other rulers to take on his ideas.
On this trip, one thing, he tried to practice his ideas, to try to persuade all the kings to accept his philosophy, the way his idea about how to govern a good society. They work together, they travel together, they help each other, they contribute their own ideas into a pool of rich philosophy.
This is one of the most famous periods of Confucius's life. During the next 14 years, Confucius traveled back and forth between around 8 of the smaller states in China's central plains, spending years in some and just weeks in others. It was a long, arduous journey. Caught in the crossfire of states at war, and without shelter or security, they'd be kidnapped, lose their way, and on many occasions, even come close to death.
在这个路上呢，遭到很多灾难。在宋国的时候呢，就司马桓推呢，曾经要杀他们。在这个矿呢，就让人家围起来以后呢，不让他走。在陈蔡那个地方呢，就是7天7夜都吃不上饭，把肚子饿，弟子们都饿得都爬不起来了。他在生当中呢，确实周围列国是很艰难困苦的。
The challenges they faced forced Confucius to refine and debate his philosophy. And it is during this time that he developed one of his most profound ideas, the concept of the Jingzi, the morally noble or superior man.
这次我们周游列国，我最深的体会是：君子喻一义，小人喻一利。
A Drinza normally is translated as noble man or gentleman, but a better translation is exemplary person, because whether it's a man or woman, we should all strive to be Drinza according to the Confucian tradition. Somebody who strives to be a Drinza should try to extend the love and care beyond the family, should care about justice and morality, not about their own self-interest, first and foremost. And it's a lifelong struggle, one that never ends.
Unlike the rulers of his own age, who ruled by the sword, Confucius believed a true Jingzi ruled with virtue, putting his people's well-being alongside his own.
在政治学里， 始终是一个最根本的问题，就是约束权力的问题。皇帝有权力，所以儒家设计了一整套东西来约束皇帝。也就是后来儒家的政治哲学，爱民，所谓的爱民如子。
But Confucius also gave the word a radical new meaning. Before him, a Jingzi meant someone of noble blood. After, it meant someone not of noble blood, but of noble character.
There's something quite revolutionary in this. He's inviting people to look beyond the trappings of power, to look beyond physical attractiveness to what we might say is an inner beauty, virtue, ethics, and the like. And so this is one of the things I think that he realized during this period of exile.
The best examples of Confucius's reinterpretation of the word 君子 are his disciples themselves. Drawn from every section of society, none were of noble birth, yet all had the innate potential to be noble of character.
Amongst his disciples, there were all types. His disciple Zigong was a merchant. Zilu was a warrior type. And two of his favorite disciples, Yan Hui was from a commoner's background, from a very, very poor family. And Zhonggong was someone whose provenance was very questionable. I love Confucius' description of Zhonggong. He said that it's possible for a descendant of a plow cattle, to be born with perfectly formed horns. I think what all this tells us is that Confucius did not measure a person's worth by way of that person's family background.
At the time, Confucius was very concerned with training future generations so that they would be good and moral leaders. So this idea, what we can call political meritocracy, that the political system should be designed with the aim of selecting rulers with superior ability and virtue, that's central to the Analects of Confucius, and it's very central to the whole Confucian tradition.
These ideals didn't just apply to potential rulers. The ideas of Li and Jingzi found their origin in the most important unit in Chinese life, the family. At Chinese New Year, millions of workers from all over China return home to their families in what is the largest mass migration of humans on the planet. At the heart of this celebration is another of Confucius's most important concepts, what he called xiao, often translated as filial piety. Made from the Chinese character for old above the character for young, xiao illustrates the respect the young must pay to their elders and ancestors. And over time, xiao became so important to Confucian thinking, it developed its own manual, the Xiao Jing.
孙体法夫，受之父母，不敢毁伤，孝之始也。子曰：孝子之事亲也，居则知其乐，养则知其乐，病则知其忧，善则知其哀，忌则知其言，无解备也。 人后人事亲。
The reality of China's economic boom means that many families now live thousands of miles apart. And for many migrant workers, this is the only time in the year they can return home to see their parents.
我现在回湖南衡阳老家， 很久，我也好几年没回家了，都在外面，所以我老妈身体不好，我小孩一直都在这身边。20多岁的人的思想全面，他就这个思想好像有点，像小孩子那一种怕孤单，所以给点时间陪他。
你比我幸运，我13年没在家过生日了。
13年。
哇，好不容易哦。13年不容易啊！13年，其实说13年好漫长的。
挺快的，对我来说非常快。我工作正好13年了。
我觉得很煎熬啊！我就算1年不回家看一次我老爸，我都觉得很煎熬，因为我太想他，因为他也是最想我。
In Sima Qian's biography, we are told that Xiao came to Confucius naturally from an early age. Rather than playing with normal toys, Confucius spent his childhood staging elaborate ancestral rites, in particular for his father, who had died when he was just 3. And as Confucius grew up, he realized that the values he found in the family, exemplified by the love one had for one's parents and grandparents, could be extended outwards for the benefit of the rest of society.
These things should come naturally. I mean, it's natural for the young to respect the older person. It's natural in the village that the elderly actually get their share of food first. I think his genius is that he realized that there is a moral grounding to those practices. What was that moral grounding? It has to do with empathy. He thought of empathy as the one thing that distinguished humans from other animals. That if we are born with that sense, that sort of that stirring of empathy, why not expand it? Why not make it work for the family, for the community, for the state?
For all Chinese, the heart of the New Year celebrations is the gathering of the family together in the family home. Before the New Year meal can take place, it's customary to honor one's ancestors. For religion in China isn't to a god, it's to one's shared past.
身体健康啊，年年拜下祖宗啊，保佑你们身体健康，年年会读书啊，来。
In Confucian thought, this is where Chinese religiosity lies, in the family.
拜了祖宗一起吃饭。
And it's through rituals like these that one learns to become a 君子, a moral person.
我其实是个孝子来的，我想让我老妈呢，一个人在家其实就是不孝我呀。年代不同嘛，他年轻人压力大，所以造成我这样的现象是很多的，确实很多。老年人像我老妈。 我可以这样说，如果是我老妈，她不是得那个病，我100%的把她带出去了，我也不会让她一个人待在家里。最大的心愿啊，我要把这个古老的房子要解决它，让我老妈呢住上洋房了。 现在式的洋房，让他想一想现在式的轻浮啊！说实在，这是普天之下做儿女的一份心。
In 484 BC, after 14 long years on the road, Confucius abandoned politics and finally returned home. Unable to find any rulers to take on his ideas, instead, he decided to transfer his attention to the training of a new generation of Junzi.
By that time, he was already 68. And once he was invited back to come home, then it was said that his gate was just flooded with young men who wanted to learn from him. And what exactly did they want to learn from him? I think has to do with the art of government, because several of his chief disciples later on actually became very important people in government. Zigong, for instance, served as a counselor, and Zilu had a high political position, and there was Zhonggong was an administrator. And so maybe these young men felt that Confucius could teach them something about statecraft, about the art of government, and also how to get into government.
博之以学，约之以礼，亦可以服判矣夫。
To train this new generation, Confucius developed a curriculum based on the ancient teachings of the past. At its heart were the 6 arts, the 6 skills a Junzi had to master in order to cultivate his character. They included Li, the rites, and Yue, music, both of which brought harmony to society. And Confucius placed these alongside the essential skills of Su, calligraphy, Su, mathematics, Yu, charioteering, and Se, archery. Most importantly, it's during this period that Confucius is said to have compiled and edited the most sacred books of Chinese history, which are now called the 5 Classics.
所以他呢就想呢把他的思想呢要传流下去，怎么办呢？就是整理古代的文献，把自己的思想呢都注入到这个古代的文献当中去。所以孔子到了他的晚年这几年呢，他主要就是整理古代的文献。 这个呢，就是教育他的弟子，当然也希望他的弟子能够把他的思想呢传承，还有一个呢宣传出去。
Confucius's Academy is the subject of one of the most well-known paintings in the Traces of the Sage series. It vividly shows the master and his disciples annotating and discussing the ancient literature.
You see the people working on the classical text, warm discussion, heated discussion. And here, Confucius himself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people sitting around him, the master and disciples, together develop new ideas. The younger generation is entirely involved in the discussion, in the continuity of tradition. This is exactly reflect the idea and how Confucianism developed over history.
The 5 Classics were canonized alongside the Analects of Confucius during the Han Dynasty, over 600 years after his death. Erected by the emperor in the Imperial Academy, these sacred books then became the basis of China's famous imperial examination system, a rigorous set of exams that were designed to root out the most talented candidates for imperial government.
The examinations guaranteed candidates had read the classics and had understood the teachings of the sages. And if they understood those teachings, it was assumed they would be trusted advisors to the emperor and trusted officials throughout his realm.
Added to over the following centuries with books and commentaries by later disciples. At the Imperial Academy in Beijing, this vast stone library covers 189 stone steles, with their 630,000 characters, taking over 4 years to carve.
5年春，王正月，辛亥朔日，有食之，夏归宿于菜。
苦其心志，劳其筋骨，饿其体肤，空乏其身。
I think in all early civilizations, learning about one's many pasts, not a single past, is very important because past history provides precedents about what does work, how you motivate people, what you do in crises, how you resolve dilemmas. All of this is contained within the 5 classics and the various commentarial traditions.
The examinations themselves were famously rigorous. Candidates had to learn hundreds of thousands of passages from the classic texts, with question and answer sessions lasting over 3 days. Conducted at 4 different levels, from the lowest level country exams to the final test at the Imperial Academy, the pass rate was only 1 or 2%. With such power and privilege awaiting the successful few, some candidates even tried every method to succeed.
这些东西呢，就是我们科举考试中常用的作弊的东西，它叫做夹带。它有2种质地，你可以看到啊，上面那个是丝质的，底下这个是纸质的，它都比较适合用墨在上面进行书写。比如说，我们会把它放在那边的那个像这个考栏里啊，像这个文具，我们会把毛笔的中间弄空，把这东西搓成一个小卷儿放在里面，或者说放在这个砚台底下，放在各种各样的夹层里，比如说衣服上、鞋子里。有时候呢，我们会甚至要求你脱掉衣服，赤身裸体，因为有些考生他们有时候会把这些文字呢写在他们的肌肤上，因为一旦他们通过了这个考试，他们就会成为官员，他们就会获得相应的财富，获得相应的权利，这使得他们凌驾于普通人之上，所以这就相当于一道分水岭，在这边就是地狱，在那边就是天堂。
The influence of the imperial examination system was so enormous that it spread across Asia to Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. But perhaps its clearest legacy in modern China is the Gaokao, the annual national university entrance examinations, in which students from all walks of life attempt to win places, not in government, but at the nation's best universities. As a mark of their debt to Confucius, one rite of passage for many students is a trip to the Imperial Academy in Beijing, where they ask for the blessing of China's first and greatest sage.
孔圣人，愿你能保佑我考到我心仪的学府。
愿我的一切努力都能得到回报。
孔夫子，希望可以做一个像你一样的人，把学习作为一生的乐趣，不只是为了考试。
Over the past few decades, hundreds of Han Dynasty tombs have been discovered across China, many dating from around the 1st century AD, 500 years after Confucius's death. Inside are stunning representations of the Han Dynasty's vision of the world. Heaven above full of birds and beasts, and the human world of Han horses and charioteers below. If the first emperor's Qin dynasty united the country geographically in 221 BC, then it was the following Han dynasty who united it culturally over the next 400 years of their rule. And so within these tombs, we see the establishment of the cultural heroes that underpinned China's emerging national identity, including the first known portraits of Confucius.
但是他的形象一般看是什么呢？他就是带着像一般官吏的形象，戴着前高后低的帽子，叫进贤官。有时候手里织一个织，就是织鸟那个织，手织礼，这是一种古代的礼节。
The figures on Han Dynasty tombstones were often carved in different tiers, with court officials at the bottom and the gods at the top, with each figure's placement relative to the esteem in which they were held.
孔子的画像的形象一般在这个建筑物和尤其在祠堂面都画在这个屋子的上部、墙壁的上部。这个为什么画上部？一个就是对孔子的尊崇、敬仰嘛，仰就是一回上看嘛，对吧？敬仰。另外也是对儒家思想的一种敬仰和崇拜。这是他对孔子的，也是一种生前的尊重，死后也要尊敬这样的人物。
In Sima Qian's biography, we are told that Confucius died a frustrated man, having failed to convince a single ruler to take on his revolutionary ideas. Spread by his disciples after his death, it was only in the Han Dynasty that his ideas emerged to become the dominant philosophy of a now united empire.
孔子他那个思想呢，不是适用于那个时代的，所以他这个思想呢是适合于什么呢？是国家统一以后，他能够使国家呢安定下来，使社会使人民呢都能够呢和谐相处的这么一个他的一个思想。
Over successive centuries, the ideas of Confucius became so important to imperial China that every new prefecture built a temple to him, elevating him almost to the status of a god.
The word Shen, which we translate as God or spirit in Chinese, simply means an unseen influence that has an enormous impact. So you can have gods that represent mountains or rain clouds or beings that are actually living or dead that exert an enormous impact on their surroundings. And I think that's the sense in which Confucius is a god.
The Kong Miao in Beijing is now the most well-known Confucian temple. Located next door to the Imperial Academy, for the past 10 years, it has been under the care of Kongzi, a 76th generation descendant of Confucius himself.
其次呢，我从小我是出生在孔府里面的，从小在曲阜的孔庙里跑着玩耍的长大，所以，这座孔庙对我而言，它的气味让我感到非常的熟悉，很像我家乡的感觉。
was here where the emperor himself came to conduct sacrifices to Confucius twice a year. This tradition lasted until the fall of the last emperor in 1911.
当他亲自来的时候呢，他就要在紫禁城里起得非常早，半夜就要起来，然后沐浴更衣，做好一切的准备，然后由他的车驾带领着来到这个地方来祭祀。祭品的准备呢，首先我们要提到的是这个中国最传统的祭祀的这个几样祭品是牛、猪、羊，我们叫三牲。在这个地方呢，他要向孔子的神位上香，要把这个酒斟到这个爵里，就是古代的酒杯。同时呢，还要读一些注，这个注呢就是祭文，上面就写了我们是如何敬仰孔子，就是大概就是这个意思。
These rituals reveal how China's emperors had restored the ancient rights of the Zhou kings to the very heart of state life. But they also highlight the importance of xiao to imperial China.
The idea of xiao, filial piety, was important in imperial times because as Confucian ideology developed, the state was seen as the family writ large. And just as xiao could bind together a family, so could it bind together an empire and ensure that the subjects of that empire would revere the ruler, and that ruler, in reply to such reverence, would embrace and care for all of his subjects.
During the Han Dynasty, the best example of the importance of xiao in imperial culture was the elevation of Confucius's own family, the Kongs, to Chinese nobility. "500 years after his death, Confucius's family tree was painstakingly retraced, and he was appointed first ancestor to a long line of Kong family members, with the principal male line eventually inheriting the title the Duke of Kong."
因为中国的传统呢是有恩就要报的，按照中国的传统的话呢，这个孔子对后人有恩德，后就要报答孔子，就要什么呢？给孔子的后代以优待。所以从公元元年那一年呢，孔子的后代呢就被封作了一个侯爵，是保成侯。到了唐代的时候，晋升了一个公爵，这个公爵一直延续什么时候呢？一直延续到1935年。到1935年的时候，共和制度了，就不能保留公爵了，就改为了奉祀官。
After 2,000 years of genealogical records, the extended Kong family is so big, it now has its own headquarters, the Confucius Genealogy Research Center in Qufu. And it's here where all the Kong family records are kept safely and securely by a 77th generation descendant of Confucius, Kong Deming.
这一个房间呢，是收录了我们所有孔子后裔史家谱续修期间保存的最原始的一个档案资料。对我们这个孔氏家族管理这一块，包括就是说从政府这个行列也管理很严格。应该说是孔家人来说，也享受一定的这个。等于现在税收啊，或者是免一些这个兵役啊。另外就是说，我们续修家谱也对我们这个孔子后裔辨别孔子后裔真伪。
In 2009, Kong Deming unveiled a new edition of the complete family tree, which hadn't been updated for over half a century. Numbering 80 volumes, it took 12 years to complete, and it now contains over 2 million family members' names, including women, for the first time.
一开始吧，是作为孔子后裔，感觉做这个事情呢，也是应该的。但是呢，随着这个家谱续修，我们工作逐步的深入，我也是感觉到这个使命感和光荣感、自豪感也是越来越强啊！我感觉这个应该说是我这一生当中的一个最大的一个收获。
Often referred to in Chinese as the first family under heaven, the Kong genealogy is now the oldest and longest accredited family tree in history. With its over 2 million descendants living all over the world.
因为呢，从孔子文化来讲，我们姓孔的对孔子文化有很深的情怀，所以我们姓孔的后代感到自豪和有无比的信心和力量。
5 Starbucks employees caught on camera going ballistic on a customer and it was all over a cookie. The rat caught on camera immediately went viral. My name is Kaidi Tong. I'm a 77th generation descendant of Confucius. And my name, Kaidi, in fact, is derived from the Confucian Analects. My grandfather named me. He picked my name. And actually what it means is having princely qualities, the qualities of a prince.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today to speak to you. My name is James Kong, or in Chinese, Kong Chui Xu. Well, I am the 79th generation descendant of Confucius, and my grandfather is the head of the family in mainland China and the most direct line in mainland China.
4, 3, 2.
Music lovers everywhere are mourning the loss.
Being a Kong also brings its own pressures, for in return for the prestige of their family name, every member is expected to uphold the values of Confucian morality wherever they live.
When I was growing up, my mother pounded into our head. That's you are a member of the Confucius family, you're a descendant of Confucius, so don't misbehave. When you go to school, you have to be better, you have to be stronger, you have to be smarter, and you have to remember that the honor of your family, the Confucian family, and the entire Chinese people rest on your little tiny shoulders. I was 5 years old at the time.
As a 79th generation descendant of Confucius, I have an extra level of responsibility in the way I behave and the example that I give to other people. So every day I work towards this good behavior in myself and hope it inspires other people to do the same.
Confucianism's emphasis on hierarchy, tradition, and ancient etiquette has made it the focus of numerous attacks from alternative schools of thought, both during his own lifetime and in the many centuries after his death. In the 20th century, imperial traditions were often blamed for China's poverty and lack of development. Given that Confucianism was the mainstream tradition, it became a principal target. And by the late 1960s, Confucius was included in what was called the Four Olds: old culture, old ideology, old customs, and old habits.
呼应成造反了，他是把孔夫大名的门匾。 吹起来以后，他们在造反派让群众宣传，在库门口。
At the height of this period, because of Confucius's deep association with China's feudal imperial past, his legacy was dismantled, and nowhere more so than in his hometown of Qufu, where the Sankong, the 3 Confucian sites, had to be put under state protection.
因为我们是国家工作人员，因为那个时候这个国务院说是 有立了一个石碑，保护文物石碑，这是国家重点文物保护单位，就在孔府门口。我们就把这个像上周施工这种有国家的一级文物，我们就把它都埋到地底下了，啊，就把这个衣物和字画都藏到天花板上面。因为这文物是不可再生的，是国家的这个宝贝啊。当时就像周总理说那样，就是说你把它破坏了以后，你就不知道这是历史上的东西。所以，因为我是接受这样的思想，所以呢，我就这个那个时候，所以就没参加造反。
Over the past 40 years, as China has modernized and its economy thrived, it has embraced its ancient traditions with renewed pride. Nationally, Confucius has become a symbol of the depth and continuity of Chinese civilization. In the media, his teachings are being brought up to date for millions on national television.
那究竟什么是仁爱呢？说起来简单，学生问什么是仁，老师只回答2个字：爱人。
And in schools across the land, Confucianism is back at the heart of state curriculum.
那随着这个中国经济的腾飞，我们又开始寻找我们的精神家园的时候，孔子又开始站起来，要在精神上站起来。那所以说，那一定要把孔子再请出来，甚至要活在我们的心中。
小朋友们，我们该起床了。大家早上好。
At the Sihai Academy, a Confucian boarding school outside Beijing, children between the ages of 3 and 14 follow a curriculum based entirely on traditional Confucian education, with their day starting at 5:30 a.m.
这个四海孔子书院的校训是诚敬谦和
3拜。
这个诚呢是做人最重要的品质。这个谦的意思就指的是，就人做人一定要把自己摆在一个很低的位置，才能够融合于众。最后呢，实际上要达到一个和的境界。也就是说，不仅是个人的身与心的和谐，也是人与人之间的关系的和谐。
At Sihai, children are schooled not just in the modern curriculum, but also in the Confucian 6 arts. Crucially, they also learn to recite the Confucian classics by heart from a very early age.
这个自幼读中国经典，这是传统中国教育最重要的一个传统。
欲治其国者，先其其家。
那小时候读经，更重要的是利用他的记忆力，因为小朋友他的记忆力非常好，他不需要理解。年龄的增长，他的理解力逐步的增加，然后他就可以有了理解的内容。这就好比说，像那个牛去先早上把草吃进去，然后夜里再慢慢的反刍消化，第二天就转化为能量，可以去工作。我想这个可能是中国教育跟西方教育很不同的地方。
At the core of this revival in Confucian education is a focus on what many feel is the most important Confucian virtue, what he called 仁, often translated as benevolence or humanity.
好，那下面呢，我们来讲一讲这个字。这个字念什么？仁。我们知道，儒家的教育它是以仁爱为核心的，但是这个仁是什么意思呢？ 想到自己就要想到别人，哎，想到别人一定想到自己。
The word ren actually means person, but the character that he uses is the character for person and the number 2. And so what he is saying is that the way in which we become consummate as human beings lies in the roles and relationships that locate us within family and community. It should be translated as the very best conduct that one can express, becoming the very best father, becoming the very best grandmother, becoming the very best teacher.
The moment Confucius came to develop this idea was once again during his period of exile. Adrift in the warring states with no ruler accepting his ideas, it was in conversations with his disciples that he elaborated the concept of Ren, giving it its secondary impulse, the idea of empathy, what he called Shu.
夫子，有一言而可以终身行之者乎？
其孰乎？己所不欲，勿施于人。
Well, one of the problems in Western studies is arguably excessive individualism and what is the authentic self? I look deep in my heart, and once I find the answer there, then I could find the meaning to life. But Confucius says you don't just look deep in your heart. You have to look at the relations with other people. See what are the quality of those relations. If they're hierarchical, that's not such a big deal. What matters is that those relations are characterized by compassion and care.
If Confucius formulated Ren and Shu to counter the individualism of his own age, then, to many, this has clear parallels in the materialism of contemporary society. To this effect, many Chinese companies have now started to integrate Confucian ideas into the modern workplace. One of China's largest petroleum refining factories, Jinbo Petrochemicals in Confucius's home state of Shandong, has made the concept of Ren and Xiao an essential part of their management structure. These values, they believe, not only improve the morality of every worker, but also make their business more competitive.
对员工的父母，那么发放敬老金啊，同时要发放小工资啊，那么最后换来的是员工的努力，是付出，又为公司创造了更多的财富。那么就是这样，往复式循环的上升，是让企业更好，我们的员工更幸福。
我叫马英鹏，在京博石化上班。在这上班呢，自己的家人，包括父母还有孩子，都能够公司给你照顾得很全面。关于孔子，以前了解的比较少，只是从书本上看到的一些东西。尤其是进大门，我们的孔子万人的雕像特别的醒目。从来到以后，对孔子的文化了解的比较多一些了。
This combination of business and virtue, what some scholars have called practical Confucianism, is one example of how it has consistently evolved with the times, and which some now see as giving China its competitive edge.
The values of Confucianism can be seen as something that give China an advantage in its dealings with other countries, in its economic development. Confucianism emphasizes cooperation, collaboration, education, discipline, study. All of those things are important for success in the modern world.
It's a remarkable story. Rejected in his own lifetime, Confucius's teachings have come to define the deepest and most human aspects of Chinese life. From the chaos of his own times, through China's imperial age, to 21st century China's newfound status as an economic superpower, they have not only persisted, but have found new meaning in every generation. Why? Because at their heart lies a shared set of beliefs and rituals that have lasted the test of time, and which find their ultimate meaning in the most important unit of Chinese life, the family.
中国这个制度，所以20世纪以来，建立了很多的，做了很多尝试。最后，中国人他的内心还是以家庭，因为家庭才是他的一种价值观，他的人生的着落点。他在家庭里生活，他人生才有意义。
This reverence for the family stands behind one of the most important rituals in Chinese culture, the grave sweeping festival of Qingming, where all the Confucian virtues of Li, Xia, and Zun come together.
清明，因为清明不在咱农历的3月，或者就在2月。清明呢，这个木上的草青草青芽，树也发芽了。
At Qingming, young and old visit the graves of their parents and ancestors, which, for Confucius's descendants in Zhifu, means a trip to the Confucian forest, where their family members are buried.
像我们这一片，已经埋了30多口人了，都长眠在这里了。现在我是第72代，哎，这男的，他偷盗，再就是地痞流氓，他学习不能入祖坟；女的不孝敬公婆的，娼就是你反正懂什么娼对吧？卖娼。 嫖娼卖淫就是这个意思，他不能入祖坟，这是空间的规矩，这是。
有这么大一片家族墓，可能若干年以后，我也许会躺在这里，跟我的那些祖父，然后太爷爷、爷爷，然后一起长眠于此。
起来磕个头。长着我的酒外，那老爷爷不喝酒，把炒饭好了，哎。
At Qingming, the Chinese give offerings and kowtow to their ancestors as a way of repaying them, and as a way of renewing their ties with those who brought them into the world.
来，空姐，咱弟兄俩先磕个头吧，给咱爷啊，来吧，咱磕个头，来，10个头啊！哎呦，我可都跪不下了，
In Chufu, Qingming is also the occasion for the coming together of large numbers of the extended Kong family. This year, on the 2566th anniversary of his birth.
This 就是2566年以后，孔子在历史上的作用，从今天的论证机会，就可以表达出来，孔子在世界和中国人民社会中的重要地位和隐形形象。
说我们现在好多的，就是说你挖掘每个人的优点，其实就是我感觉就是我们孔子所提倡的一些优点。应该说我也感觉这个很敬佩，应该说也很荣耀，就是说自己能够从事这个家族的工作。
The gathering of the Kong family at Qingming culminates in the grave-sweeping festival to their most important ancestor, Confucius. Conducted in the same spot for over 2,000 years, this has become a ritual of national importance. Given the contribution Confucius has made, not just to the Chinese, but to so many across the world.
孔子在他的成长的历史时期呢，他的理想也是能恢复一个礼乐文化的鼎盛时代，用以礼治国，去把社会的公民的这种伦理道德水准以及社会的发展呢，上升到一个鼎盛时代。
摆空手，摆空手。
那么，作为孔子的后人，我们应该担负起一个这样传承式责任、发扬式使命的这样的一负责任。
It's a remarkable legacy, given the circumstances of Confucius's death. In the final chapters of the biography, Sima Qian writes that, aged 72, Confucius, despondent over his failure to have changed the world, witnessed the revisit of the Qilin, a portent of his own death.
仲尼视之，曰：“临也。”取之，曰：“何不出图？若不出书，无以矣夫。”
Where once the Qilin had gloriously heralded his birth, this time it was to herald his end. A few days later, visited by his faithful disciple Zigong, he uttered his last words, a quotation from the Confucian classic, the Book of Songs.
泰山坏乎？梁柱摧乎？哲人为乎？
天下君王，至于贤人众矣。当时则容，末则已焉。孔子不一，传10于世。学者宗之，可谓至圣矣。